So this week I begin with a question. What do dirty dishes have to do with sermons? Bob? Bill? No wisecracks up there, okay? Yeah. He's going to come up with probably 6 or 7 different jokes by the end of the sermon. I can see him already scribbling up there. They need to be cleaned up, the sermons. Yeah, that's possible. There's going to be some different ones you're going to come up with. I want to hear all of them afterwards. It'll be fun. Now, my first job, I worked at a restaurant called Ponderosa. How many of you have heard of the restaurant Ponderosa? Okay. I Googled it last night. There are 3 still left in Indianapolis, and all 3 are closed. Yeah, there are 3 locations that are called Ponderosa right now, and they're all 3 closed. Because when I said there are 3 in Indianapolis, your mouths dropped open. You're like, really? And they're all 3 closed. But it was my first real job, meaning that's where I punched in on a time clock. That's where I answered to the boss. That's where I looked at the bulletin board to see the schedule every week, and I made sure that I followed it meticulously. My first job, washing dishes. For 3 or 4 months straight, I was washing dishes, and it felt like I was just doing that to earn the check. I mean, I wanted to get out of that dish room as quick as possible. Can you imagine 8 to 10 hours working in dishes, coming home, your clothes are wet and your fingers are just wrinkled up like crazy? Yeah, that's the way it was. And it's 3 or 4 months of that I was just wishing to be to the next spot, like anywhere besides doing dishes, right? So they let me be cashier for a little bit. I would do cash one night, do cash register one night, and then I would do dishes another night. And then maybe a month or 2 later, they put me on salad bar here and there. And then I did some food prep as well. And then I was behind the grill for a little bit. I was kind of all over the place for a year. And at the end of the year, they upgraded me to shift manager. Shift manager. I had a new title and a new name tag. And my pay went soaring up from $4.25 an hour to $6 an hour. Someone did tell me that was a 41% increase, and I should be pretty happy with that. I've also been told in life that a percentage of nothing is still nothing, right? 425 to 6. I mean, I was responsible for the whole store, anywhere from 8 to 14 hours a day through the summer. I was running the store at $6 an hour, and I didn't have a clue, right? I was learning on the job. I truly was. It's all about perspective, isn't it? Either way, in that dish room, if you told me that later I would be at Edgewood UMC preaching a sermon, nonetheless leading out with washing dishes, I would say there's no way. That's impossible. You must be out of your mind that those 2 things could ever connect. There seemed to be no relevance to where I was in the dish room. I felt stuck in the dish room for those 3 or 4 months. I didn't realize that God was using those moments to help me grow and to learn. So I ask you, did you ever think that you would have ended up where you are now based on where you started? Can you think back to some of those moments where you were like scratching your head thinking, I don't know why God has me here in this moment? It's a great question to think about with our sermon series Off Script. All of us have had moments where we have lived life off script, where we think, okay, God, where is this leading? Where is this taking us in this moment? But when we're talking about going off script, we learn off script moments help us to understand God's calling. So we find David in a similar position that we have been in. A shepherd taking care of sheep, not knowing the future. And David is called to the house. Think about when you were a child and you were called to the house. Was that a good thing usually? No. Most of the time it was not a good thing. You were called back to the house because you either didn't do your chores correctly, or you forgot to do your chores altogether, or it was time to stop playing and doing something else, getting in the car, going to a doctor appointment, whatever it may have been. But growing up as children, we often used outdoors as an escape, right? And then when we were playing and having fun, we were called indoors. It was not a good moment. But for David, it was. David was called to the house. We find here that as he's called to the house, he is anointed as the future king of Israel. Saul calls David into his service. For David, life goes off script in this very moment. It's a dramatic change. He is known for being a shepherd. If you know anything about shepherds in the Old Testament, the New Testament, shepherds, you kind of kept your distance from them because they smelled funny. Oftentimes they were kind of thought as a little bit crazy too, because they were out stuck with sheep all the time and they were talking to themselves and meandering. And some people didn't like shepherds being on their property or grazing off their property. So I'm guessing that David had some serious questions because all he was known for is being a shepherd and playing the harp. He may have felt in one thought that he was hitting the jackpot, but in another way, he was feeling probably nervous or unqualified. He's probably thinking that he was only a shepherd, only a musician. Now for David, this takes another twist, another turn, and it becomes another off-script moment. David comes all this way. He is anointed. He is called into Saul's service. And then he is asked to play the harp. Why? Well, Saul was being troubled by demons. Leaders felt that this playing of the harp could soothe Saul and create peace. It was a common practice in the ancient world, and we think of music as therapy today, don't we? This idea of an evil spirit is unsettling. The advisors of Saul suggested to him that they find a musician to provide peace and healing. Saul agrees to this, maybe as a moment of self-awareness in his life. Most definitely, this was a God moment. Saul tells his advisors to search for a musician, for the best musician. I emphasize the word search for a reason, because Saul says search, and it's the same exact word that's used earlier in chapter 16, where God was searching for Israel's king. So God searched for David first, and then Saul and his team searched out David to play the harp. We can see in this very moment that these two worlds intersect. Our need and what God is searching for, those two things intersect at this point and create an off-script moment. But it's in this off-script moment that we see God's will play out. We see God's calling play out, because the off-script moment seems strange. David's anointed as king, but hold on there. Slow your roll. You're going to be playing a harp for a long time. That's what you'll be doing in the palace. You won't be ruling, you'll be playing your harp. And those two needs intersect off script, and we recognize God's will in the making. Now, we all agree that life goes off script, but when this happens, what should we do? What should we do when there's a turn that is unexpected? Well, it's our natural inclination to hurry things up. It's our natural inclination to make things awkward, isn't it? When we go off script, we get anxious. Sometimes we want to fill the void with activity. We want to busy ourselves to get our minds off of the difficulties that we are facing. We want to skip ahead a few chapters so that we don't have to deal with what we're dealing with right now. Listen, God will call us to do different things at different times in our lives. The biggest misconception that we have as Christians is that God only gives us one calling for our entire life. We have put ourselves through a lot of stress and anxiety thinking of what is that one thing that God is calling us to do. The pressure that we have had on earlier on in life for our calling is a pressure that we have placed on ourselves. What if God is calling us to recognize that there are different callings throughout life, that God has called us to do many things, that it's not just this one thing that God is calling us to do, and that we can't be happy unless we find the one thing. What if we recognize that God is calling us to do different things throughout our life? That God is calling us to play the harp today. God is calling us to wash the dishes today. That God is calling us to be in this moment to see how God will provide through those times, through those off-script moments. What if we ask God to help us find the purpose in playing the harp today? What if we ask God for the purpose for playing the harp through this season? Here's what you need to know about our off-script moments. Know that in some seasons we are called to play the harp. In other seasons we are called to lead. For some seasons we are called to be teachers. In others we are the students. We are the novices. We're the ones that need to sit back and to listen and learn. For some seasons we are stay-at-home parents. In other seasons we are supervisors. For some seasons we are the visionaries. And for other seasons, we are here to help carry out someone else's vision. Sometimes we are called to wash dishes, clean bathrooms, to dumpster dive for silverware. Yes, I have lots of stories. The restaurant business does that for you, right? And other times we're called to be a shift manager. Sometimes we are sons and daughters, and sometimes we are called to take care of aging parents. We have many different callings throughout life, and I want to tell you today that one calling is not better than another calling. We have made that mistake of reading our own humanity into the callings and of saying, well, this gift is better than that gift, or this call is better than that call. What God has called you to do today is the very best thing that you can be doing because it's in God's timing. No matter what the title is, no matter what you're experiencing in that moment, if it just feels hard, if it just feels difficult, if it's the very last thing you wanted to do, and God is calling you to do that in the moment, it's the highest calling that you can receive. Because God is calling you in this moment. Today, let us forget this idea that you are only called to do one thing, or the myth that you have a lifelong calling to do one thing. So let's not ask the question, God, what are you calling me to do the rest of my life? But what are you calling me to do today, in this season? We find in today's passage that bringing my harp means that I'm totally honoring the blessing to do what God has called me to do in this season and in this moment. Time to God is eternal, so we do what God is calling. We've often made this mistake, haven't we? Trying to figure out what God's calling is for our life. We do it as people, and we also do it as a church. We could accidentally do this in the visioning process. What is God calling us to do 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And God keeps leading us back to be present in the moment. Because if we look at 5 years down the road, we would all be overwhelmed. We would all have a lot of questions. We would all ask how. And we would say it's impossible. And you're right. It is when you try to take it 5 years in one day. What God's asking us to do is to ask what God is calling us to do today. To be faithful with what God is calling us to do in this moment. And it's those baby steps that'll get us to 5 years, that'll get us to 6 months from now, that'll get us to 1 year, so that we don't have to be overwhelmed by it all. God didn't intend for it to be that way. Oh, it's great to set goals and all, but I guarantee you all the goals that we set will be changed by God. They will be directed by God, and we will be led in different directions than we could have ever imagined because we're following God one day at a time. Do not be overwhelmed by God's calling, because God's calling for you today is just as special as what He's calling you to do 1 year from now and 5 years from now. Here's another learning. We learn the difference between our script and God's script. I was thinking about David's life and how frequently it went off script. There is no doubt, if you've studied David's life, there's no doubt that he was human. He took his life off script by the poor choices he made on a regular basis. There are times where we take it off script by the choices we make. And there are times where God takes it off script. The thing that was special about David, though, is that he came back to this moment of recognizing and confessing and writing songs and writing poems about his mistakes, because he knew that those moments were still redeemable by God. He seemed to have a much better understanding than I did, and than I still do, of honoring what God is doing in the very moments that we are experiencing. Remember, when I was washing dishes, cleaning bathrooms, and dumpster diving, the whole time I couldn't wait until the day I was promoted. I couldn't wait until I got the raise. I couldn't wait until I didn't have to put on the dish uniform any longer. I didn't have to clean out the drain any longer. You know the story. Like, you can make a whole list of, I can't wait until I don't have to do this any longer. What was David doing? He was living into that moment. And some of those moments were really difficult. Some of those moments were very shameful. And he was talking about them, confessing them, and realizing his own sin in the midst, and recognizing God's room to redeem in the midst of that. Wanting to jump onto the next chapter too quickly is a sin that we often commit. We don't realize that God is working right there in that moment to redeem the script. David is one of those biblical characters who is well known, but David's story does not begin with him defeating the giant. We often tell that story, don't we? David defeating the giant. But before David ever slayed the giant, David was known for his gift of playing the harp. He was not known for throwing a sling. He was known for playing strings. In 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 1, David is called the beloved singer of Israel. Doesn't sound a whole lot like a warrior in that statement, does it? He was a musician, a singer, a composer of songs. Do you realize he wrote 3,600 poems and 450 songs? Wouldn't it be great to write one song? I mean, for most of us, it'd be like, wow, that would be a dream to be able to compose and to be able to write one song. 450 songs. It's incredible. But in our version of the story, we have often redacted that part as insignificant, or at least said it was less significant than David the warrior or David the king. What we do with David's story is what we often do with our story. We minimize certain parts. We redact certain parts that we don't like as much, or that we would like to forget. When life starts to go off script, it's our natural response to redact it, to spin it, to dress it up. We didn't enjoy that job anyway, so on to a new job, on to something else, right? So we redact that part. We didn't feel successful in this place or that place, so we redact that piece. We tell another story instead. Anything we deem as insignificant, we redact it. We think, I definitely don't want to tell anyone about that part of my story, so we redact that. We are ashamed to say it aloud, so we redact it. When we meet other people, we give them the redacted version of our story. When we go to church, sometimes we give the redacted version. When we write a resume or go to a job interview, I guarantee you, we give the redacted version. We give the polished version. We give all the things that we like to talk about, that we feel comfortable talking about. When we talk to God, we are known for giving the redacted version. Because we are like Adam and Eve hiding in the garden again, aren't we? We go right back to that we are ashamed, that we are hiding our own deficiencies. And so we redact these different portions. While we are busy redacting, we are missing the very power of God to provide forgiveness in the moment and show his redeeming power of living off script. Here's the thing. David doesn't use the sling unless he plays the strings. By the time David goes to the battlefield, he has gained the king's trust. Because of days and weeks and months on end, he has been playing the harp, entrusted to ease the anxiety of the king. He has built up a trust to point people where they can go. He has built up a trust where people believe him and trust their care to him, to his leadership. Playing the harp was a necessary part of David's story. Here it is, people. Every season in your life is significant. You don't get to decide which is significant and what is insignificant. You don't get to judge, planned or unplanned, what is significant and what is not significant. Because if we truly embrace the sovereignty of God, then we can truly embrace every circumstance, every tear, every decision, every off-script moment. We don't need to redact it. We need to share it as another moment where God has redeemed us. With God, nothing is wasted. So keep showing up. Keep playing the harp. In this verse, David is supposed to be king, but he's not. He's playing harp for the king. We can fill in the blank. I'm supposed to be blank, but I'm not. I'm supposed to have all of this figured out by now, but I don't. I'm supposed to be financially secure, but I'm not. I'm supposed to know what I want to do with the rest of my life, but I don't. You can create a lot of sentences that way. I'm supposed to, whatever pressure you're feeling in your life, you can say, well, I'm supposed to do this, but I haven't yet, or I don't have it figured out. David was right where he's supposed to be, and you are too. For this reason, you are right where God needs you to be. Where you are, there is no accident. It's right where you need to be to prepare where you need to be tomorrow. It's one step at a time. It's bring your harp. It's play it today. It may be confusing, but continue to bring your harp.